Hi, and welcome to Finding Your Way Through Therapy, a proud member of the Sightcraft Network. The goal of this podcast is to demystify therapy, what can happen in therapy, and the wide array of conversations you can have in and about therapy. Through personal experiences, guests will talk about therapy, their experiences with it, and how psychology and therapy are present in many places in their lives, with lots of authenticity and a touch of humor. Here is your host, Steve Bisson.
Toujours aussi content de vous voir. Always happy to see you. Welcome to episode 179. If you haven't listened to episode 178 yet, please go listen to it because we prepare you for the holidays. I know I'm about 2-3 weeks early before the holidays, but might as well get that coaching in from finding your way through therapy before you go there. So please go back and listen if you haven't listened to it yet. But episode 179 will be with Erica Curry. Erica is a former D1 athlete and now is a licensed therapist and coach. She helps athletes with their goals for athletics as well as career goals. She uses mindfulness, the stress tolerance, emotional regulation, and communication. This is a lot of stuff from dialectical behavioral therapy or DBT, so I'm sure we're going to talk about that. She likes to develop the skills for her clients. She also talks about mental healing after an injury, finding yourself after sports retirement, addiction, self-harm, as well as relationship issues. We're going to talk about all that. But first, here's a word from free.ai. Getfree.ai. Yes, you've heard me talk about it previously in other episodes, but I'm going to talk about it again because Getfree.ai is just a great service. Imagine being able to pay attention to your clients all the time instead of writing notes and making sure that the note's going to sound good and how are you going to write that note and things like that. Getfree.ai liberates you from making sure that you're writing what the client is saying because it is keeping track of what you're saying and will create after the end of every session a progress note. But it goes above and beyond that. Not only does it create a progress note, it also gives you suggestions for goals, gives you even a mental status if you've asked questions around that, as well as being able to write a letter for your client to know what you talked about. So that's the great thing. It saves me time, it saves me a lot of aggravation, and it just speeds up the progress note process so well. And for $99 a month, I know that that's nothing. That's worth my time. That's worth my money. You know, the best part of it too is that if you want to go and put in the code Steve50 when you get the service, at the checkout code is Steve50, you get $50 off your first month. And if you get a whole year, you save a whole 10% for the whole year. So again, Steve50 at checkout for getfree.ai will give you $50 off for the first month. And like I said, get a full year, get 10% off, get freed from writing notes, get freed from always scribbling while you're talking to a client, and just paying attention to your client so they win out, you win out, everybody wins. And I think that this is the greatest thing. And if you're up to a point where you got to change the treatment plan, well, the goals are generated for you. So getfree.ai, code Steve50 to save $50 on your first month. Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 179. I'm very excited to have Erica Curry on my podcast. I saw her, we met through, I believe it was a Facebook page of some sort. And, you know, there's a lot of curiosity. I like talking about sports. She was a D1 athlete, and she is now coaching athletes and how to work on certain things. So I was very excited to see her. It's a little change of pace with, you know, we went from dogs to first responders to now talking about this. So I like to change the pace on my podcast. Erica, welcome to Finding Your Way Through Therapy.
Yeah, thanks so much, Steve. We did connect on Facebook, and your stuff really did stand out to me. I have some family that are first responders, and being an athlete my whole life, I see a lot of similarities between the discipline of first responders and being an athlete. It really sets you up for having a disciplined routine. And yeah, I'm a licensed therapist for the last 7 years, and then I also provide coaching for people who are outside the state of California because I'm licensed here. And I've been doing specifically dialectical behavioral therapy and radically open dialectical behavioral therapy for about the last 5 years. And once I found dialectical behavioral therapy, I knew like I found the therapy that I will be doing the rest of my life. I don't know why anyone does anything else. And yes, it's not going to be for everyone. I just know it was for me. And there's so many people that it could be for. So I'm very excited anytime I get to chat about it.
We're going to chat about it for sure because I'm actually trained in dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. We're going to use that as an acronym from now on. I was trained by people from Marshall Linehan's team. So that's how long ago I did it. And I really enjoy it. And I think it's very beneficial, but we'll get into that a little more detail. You said you were a D1 athlete. What did you play?
I was a springboard and platform diver. I went to school on the East Coast. I was at a tiny private liberal arts school called Wagner College on Staten Island.
Okay.
Uh, and I was there all 4 years. And that's where the door really propped open for figuring out that I really wanted to go into mental health. Everything from, I remember in high school, I had a teacher who said, like, you seem really interested in psychology, to majoring in psychology and really liking all the therapy related courses that I took. That and like I was always the friend that people would come to talk about this, that, or the other thing. And I do love talking. So it kind of made sense.
Well, it's perfect for the podcast too, for having you talk a lot. So yeah, I actually know where Wagner was, so it's not so small that I didn't know where that was. But I am on the East Coast, so that could explain a whole
Yeah.
lot. Yeah, and when you said the platform diving and the springboard, I'm like, I just watched that on the Olympics. I don't watch it otherwise, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm having like heart palpitation for them. It's really, really, it's nerve-wracking.
Yeah, it's so nerve-wracking. And especially the last two Olympics, I've had a former teammate who he's been in the Olympics both this last round and the round before. And it's like extra heart palpitations because like I know him and I'm like, all right, I know you got this. Like you've been training for this since you were 10. I was there.
Yeah, and I think that you said it yourself when first responders and people who are D1 athletes, they have a lot of similarities, not only to discipline, but also missing the holidays and being very isolated sometimes because of the work that you do.
Yeah, it really sucks you into your own subculture and your
Yeah.
own community. And when it comes to, and yes, it's like same and different because it's the whole, once you're not in your sport anymore, it's like, how do you reintegrate? And then similarly for first responders, like if they've been like deployed or if they've been just in their job for a long time, trying to acclimate to being in a group outside of that can be really, really hard. And that's one of my like sweet spots as a therapist is helping people figure out those transitions in life. Is like, okay, so what is important to me? How do I take what's important to me from my job or my sport and take those values without losing myself?
And also just integrating a world that you may or may not know because it's so different. People who are not D1 athletes don't understand the commitment. I just see it in like my high school daughters who are now going through just varsity stuff. And, they play soccer 6, 7 days a week and you got to be available. You got to move them around. So there's a whole lot. And this is just high school varsity Division 5 stuff in Massachusetts. So.
Yeah, it can get really. I remember before I was a diver, I was a gymnast, and I thought that I was like, I want to go to the Olympics for this. This is what I want to do. And my parents started looking into like, okay, how do I go to an alternative school so I could just train? I ended up suffering a career-ending injury and had to pivot. Luckily, diving is like a really great pivot, but that was also really hard. So yeah, like yeah, I'm no stranger to knowing just how much sports can pick up and like change the whole trajectory of like what a normal life looks like growing up.
And I also think about those sports that you just mentioned. It's a different stress than if you play for a basketball team, a football team. And I'm not putting it down. I'm just saying it's very different. It's apples to celery, as I call it.
Mhm.
Because being on that platform alone, having to dive, it's not like you have a redo. You don't have anyone to cover for you. It's just you.
Yep, exactly. It's a lot of heat on, and that's probably, I think that's the thing I miss the least from being a diver. It's like the whole place going silent. You can feel all the eyeballs on you. And I was just talking to an athlete the other day who like got to try, I actually met Alona Mar, the rugby player. And I
Yeah.
asked her, I was like, what's the difference to you from being in your rugby games versus like Dancing with the Stars, where it's like you and your partner? And she said basically to the same effect. She was like, well, my partner's a professional dancer and I'm not. So obviously all eyes are on me. And when I'm with my team and there's a mistake, I at least have that like village around me. I was like, that's a really good point. And yeah, I know the feeling of feeling like all eyes are on you and you have no one to blame stuff on but yourself. If it goes wrong, it can be so much pressure.
You know, I once heard Michael Phelps talk about that pressure that he went through and how isolating it was and how difficult, and he had to go to therapy for a long time, even led him to thoughts of suicide, substance abuse, the whole nine yards. He's very open about this. This is not something I'm breaking a wall here. You know, I think that we can go on and on about individual being a lot more difficult, in my opinion, than a team. Not that
Mhm.
team is easier by any chance and by any
Yeah,
stretch, but it's just a different type of mentality.
it is different. Yeah.
So, well, let's talk about just what I just talked about, Mr. Phelps. I worked for a company where he was one of the spokespersons for therapy. So now I always ask the same thing to all my guests, and this is a standard question here. Have you ever been in therapy?
I have been to therapy and I currently go to therapy every other week. Natasha is great. That's the name of my therapist. I really like normalizing even just saying like the names, like the name of my therapist, just because it's like therapists, like we kind of just like live under a rock, it almost seems, because like it's not talked about. And obviously, yes, there's things like confidentiality. And I think things that clients don't realize is you're allowed to talk about your therapist all you want. Like that is totally fine. Your therapist is going to keep everything extremely close to the vest because confidentiality is very important. But when it comes to the client, like you want to say like, oh yeah, my therapist Erica, like you're allowed to say whatever you want. And yeah, I think therapy is just so important that as I'm attending to so many other people's mental health, that it helps me be able to recenter and focus on mine as well, especially when it comes to like warding fending off burnout, because I'm someone who I really like to work. I really like to help as many people as I can, and sometimes to my own detriment. And I remember when I first started, I really had to figure out that balance. And I would probably say not until I started my own private practice did I feel like I really had the option to create balance, just because I mean, hey, you got to pay bills and stuff. And when you're working for somebody else, it's very difficult. You have to see so many people. And I mean, I live in Southern California, so it's not the cheapest place to live.
No.
So I gotta say the thing that changed the game for me, that made me, instead of feeling like going to my own therapy was a chore, now it feels like something I get to do because I feel like I have the space and actually really want to attend to my own mental health. And I'm benefiting from that. My clients benefit from that. And I personally think every therapist should have their own therapy. And just for me to graduate from my graduate program for my master's, I had to get at least 40 hours of my own personal therapy. I had been in therapy before that, but I'm really glad most programs, if you're going to become a therapist, you have to go to your own therapy.
You know, it's so refreshing because, you know, when the psychoanalytic world was around, much more predominant than any other treatment, they used to have to do, I think, 3 or 4 years of therapy 3 times a week in order to become a therapist. And while maybe, in my opinion, that's a little excessive in some way, I also see the value in that. And I think it's very important to know what it is to sit in the chair of a therapist.
Well, and I think you also bring up, because that leads to another topic in my own brain of like having to go to therapy that much. There's also a barrier to becoming a therapist that's really hard to see until you're in it. It is not an accessible profession by any means. The things that are expected of therapists before they ever make a cent doing it is sometimes an entire 3,000 hours. Like personally, I am so grateful that I went through my traineeship, and yes, a huge chunk of my hours were unpaid, but that place did eventually end up hiring me before I was licensed. Not everyone is so lucky. And can you imagine if you're having to pay to go to your own therapy to graduate, and then you have to also pay to go to work because you have to drive there? some people have to pay their supervisors. So it's not only are you not getting paid, you have to pay for your supervisor's time. That, yeah, if it used to, like back in the day when it was like, oh yeah, you have to go to hours and hours of therapy, it's like, no wonder there's a therapist shortage. And yes, there does need to be a lot of standards to become a therapist because it's a very vulnerable setting. And I'm always like, I wonder how we can make therapy, like becoming a therapist, more accessible with making sure that there are high standards to become a therapist. So that really comes to mind when you mention like the frequency of therapy and all these like invisible barriers that you don't really know until you get into it. And I remember feeling shocked.
Well, I remember also reading, and it's still true to this day, having a mental health counseling or social work degree is like the
Mhm.
second and fourth least paid master's level program in the country. Like philosophy, and I can't remember the other one is, but philosophy is number one. It's kind of scary how much we have these things that we need to fulfill, and for I'm okay with some of those, but then besides that, oh, by the way, you're going to be paid less than most people. Good luck.
Yeah. And that's why it's like anyone who is a therapist, they are in it because their heart has called them to do it. They are not, no one's becoming a therapist to be like, yep, can't wait to get that fat paycheck. It's like, no, this person has taken years and has honed a skill and is still continuing. And we're typically people who love to learn. We love to keep learning and gaining new skills. And that's what's been so exciting to me about DBT and now RO DBT because I'm getting to, because they're broken up into specific skills, I feel like I get to be so detail oriented about how well I can apply these skills and help people learn when they need to use what set of skills. It's such a beautifully paved roadmap. And that's the big part with DBT that I'm like, and why isn't everyone just using this? How come this isn't like a court? Like to me, I'm like, this should just be in schools. This should just be a class. Like you should have social emotional learning, and it could just be you are learning these coping skills. You'll get distress tolerance, emotion regulation, mindfulness, and communication. Like that to me, that just sounds obvious. So anytime I get to talk about it, I'm like, let's get into it.
I've always been a fan of DBT. The only thing I was never a fan, because when you do the training, you also have to do some of it. Doing those diary cards just drove me absolutely bonkers.
Oh my, they are detailed. They really, I had to do a diary card too when I went through my training, and I was like, oh my goodness, okay. I'm trying to watch a little less TV. And yeah, it is something that you have to pull out every single day. And it's like, I'm trying to think like the amount, I think it's like a sweet spot with how many targets you give yourself or someone else. It's like you can't have a list of, oh my gosh, stop, is that your teacher's manual?
Yeah.
Right. Do you
That's why I had
literally
to share it with everyone. Good. This is one Bible that I love. There's so many things in here, and there's things that you hand out to people that I absolutely adore that I don't have here. My handouts are
Yeah,
in another room,
here are
but
the handouts. That's the
yeah,
handout book.
Marcia had something going when she created that, and I give her a lot of credit.
Well, in her beautiful story, have you read her book called Building a Life Worth Living? I highly, highly recommend it. It is just her amazing life story of how she pulled, because do you know a little bit anything about her story?
Yeah, I know a
Yeah,
little bit about her.
so
Sorry.
it is just such a beautiful read, and I think that it can really help anyone who's struggling figure out, okay, what does it mean to build a life worth living? And it just paints this picture of how she struggled so, so hard. And she promised if she pulls herself out of hell, she will go back and pull everyone else out of hell. And like like, geez, does she stay true to her word? Like, look at everything she came up with. So I think like anyone who's like looking for a good therapy read, I like that's the first book I always recommend.
We were off line when we said this, but I think it's important for us to say it here too. DBT is not just for personality disorder, particularly borderline personality disorder. It is used, I use it personally. I know me
Mhm.
and Erica were talking about how she uses it, and I use it in therapy, but I there's I work with a lot of first responders. If I ever said that we're doing DBT, I think they would run away from the room as fast as they possibly could.
Yeah, if they've heard about it, right? Because it's like you Google it and it's like, oh, I don't think I need that. And the thing, because since I work with primarily athletes, when I tell them like this is the orientation that I use and I'm able to like share my own experience, because I'm personally not diagnosed with any personality disorder, I have generalized anxiety disorder. And the one skill that I'm always able to really like nail home for all my athletes is the emotion regulation skill of coping ahead in the manual comes straight out of sports psychology. Like that's
Right.
where she got that one from. And it's all about just like how athletes visualize success. Guess what? You can do that in your regular life. It doesn't only have to be in your sports setting. It can be with a conversation going the way you want it to. It can be with a trip to the grocery store going the way that you want it to. It can be anything. And then it's just like the rest of the skills make sense because it's like, oh, okay, so I kind of just can take the ways that I've learned to cope and then generalize that to my life. It's like, yep, that's what we're going for. And there's very specific sets of skills that I can teach you because I remember my first boss when I like really dove into DBT, she told me she was like, I really hate you because you like have the DBT skills built into you already. I was like, oh, thanks. She was like, yeah, you just have to like learn the names of them and then apply them. But like, you're one of those very regulated people. I was like, I'm really just very anxious on the inside and hold it in well, but thank you. So, and I do think it speaks to the basics of coping skills you gain as an athlete. And I think first responders can be very similar in that way. There's a lot of skills that you learn, but you don't have any names for them. So what DBT does is it puts names on the skills you already have so that you can more readily pull from your toolbox.
Right. And I think that that's, you were mentioning Marcia earlier. I also remember, when you start off, you're in a house and you're in the basement, the house is on fire and you got to get
Yes.
out of hell.
Mhm.
And, you can accept the latter, you don't. And just that imagery is a good way to think about what these skills can do. You can get out of a fire or you
Mhm.
can stay in your basement of hell. You can choose. And I
Yeah.
always liked that imagery. So I wanted to share that with the audience. Mostly, I know you know that story.
Mhm.
But when you think about DBT, there's a lot of specific skills. There's a lot of skills that you learn from it. Which ones do you think that really apply to the athletic background of the people you work with?
Oh, well, I'd say like coping ahead is like a very obvious one, but I would say outside of that, when it comes to like ones that are very helpful, would be mindfulness. And that's like, of course, the core foundational skill set. It's what is taught in group therapy between every single module because it's so foundational. And I would go as far as to say, like, specifically the how skill of non-judgmentalness and what it means to be non-judgmental. I kid you not, Steve, when I learned this, like it changed my life because I was like, everyone likes to say they're non-judgmental, right? Like, I don't judge anyone. And it's like, okay, well, actually, from birth, we are all taught to be judgmental and for good reason. Being judgmental is part of what helps keep us safe. The difference is what type of judgment are we using? Because there's a difference between discernment and evaluative judgments. And once I learned, oh, what we're trying to leave behind or drop is the evaluative judgment and stick with discernment, it changed everything because discernment is describing specifically what needs to change or what's different from before. And it reminds me of coaching. Like a good coach is able to discern what you need to do differently to be better. And
Right.
if your coach, like if a coach is saying, oh, that was good, that was bad, it's like, okay, but what was good about it? What was bad about it? You can't just have those evaluative, this was good, this was bad, that was worse, this is better. You have to be able to describe it. And that's what non-judgmentalness really hits home with. And it also, once you start using non-judgmental language to describe other things, it starts to seep into how you talk about yourself, which I
Right.
love too. It is the long game. It's not like you practice non-judgmentalness for a week and all of a sudden you love yourself. I will say though, you do like I remember I stopped doing things like I don't say like, oh, I'm such an idiot. Like, why would I say that to myself? That's something I used to say all the time and I didn't think much of it. And now I'm like, no, that's actually really damaging. I wouldn't say that to anyone else. And also, like, what does that even mean? an evaluative judgment. Like if I'm trying to discern what is this even coming from, and it like puts me in a position to actually look at the facts for what they are and
Right.
look at what I'm thinking about. So I would say the mindfulness modules very pivotal and specifically non-judgmentalness from the mindfulness house skills.
And how we talk to ourselves is so important. I talk about that all the time. And, calling yourself an idiot or calling yourself whatever name is
Yeah.
not helpful. And the other one that I kind of use loosely from DBT is people who apologize for everything. And I go, look, and truthfully, I'm Canadian. I'm born and raised in Canada. So I tell
Mhm.
people I'm a Canadian. I don't apologize all that much. So don't be the Canadian, all right? Just don't apologize for just being you.
I do love that. That's like, oh, and the communication skills. How cool is it that there's legit scripts that you can use? Because you're pulling that from what, Dear Fast, right?
Mhm.
The A, no apologies. And I
Shh, don't tell anyone I'm doing this.
and it's like I love that so much though, because it doesn't say you just don't apologize. I love that it's specific on like, I need you to step back, take a beat, and think about if an apology is warranted, and then taking the extra step, if the apology is warranted, let's make that apology meaningful. Let's talk
Right.
about how your behavior is going to change so that this doesn't happen again. Because your apology doesn't mean much if your behavior is not going to change. And so it's like it really holds that dialectic of not apologizing. And if you need to, we need this to be effective.
Yeah. And I like that this is what dialectic is. It's, cognitive behavioral therapy, all or nothing thinking happens a lot. I
Yeah,
practice Buddhism, so thinking about how life is not just the ends, we're both, and we got to find the middle ground. I mean, I always think about dialectical as a basis for most therapy and anything that's healthy in this world.
absolutely. I couldn't agree more. That was another thing when I learned what a dialectic was. I was like, how come everyone doesn't know this? Two things can be true at the same time. And when that understanding happens and you see like the light switch flip on for someone, it opens up so much opportunity and possibility. Because I remember always feeling like stuck when it felt like it was either this or that, and you couldn't have both. I wish I had like a specific example, but I remember specifically in college, I would feel like that a lot. Like it was either you can spend time with your friends or you are going to practice really early in the morning. You can't have both. And it's like, well, you can have both. It's not like you can go all in on both of those. Like you can spend some time with your friends so that you're, and then still be very ready for practice in the morning. So no, you're not staying out till 2 a.m. in New York City because you have to be up by 4 for practice.
Right.
But I just remember things feeling very black and white, and then learning what a dialectic was really bridged the gap.
And I use that in emotional standards too when people talk about, well, I'm sad. And I said, what else? You mean I can have more than one? I'm like, yeah, you can be sad
Yeah.
and angry and happy and everything else,
Uh-huh.
and it's learning that dialect, it's not either or approach, it's somewhere in the middle, and finding that middle ground is always the challenge, in my opinion. But I agree with you 100%. And for an athlete, like you said, I can go out to New York City for till 10, 11 o'clock, but I got to
Yeah.
be at my practice at 4. And you can
Yeah.
do both, but you pay the price and you're willing to pay the price. I guess that's okay.
Yeah, and that's like one of my favorite like little games. Well, I think it's a game because I find it fun to play with clients. Is like when they're learning about what a dialectic is, it's like just notice throughout the week how many times you say the word but. And I want you to see if you could say the word and instead and just see how that changes things. I'm not saying it's not like you messed up if you said but. I just want you to notice it because remember, we're being non-judgmental. So it's just about noticing it and kind of turning your mind to like, how would that go if I said and? And then similarly with non-judgmentalness, I think it's a lot of fun to play the game of like, okay, now notice every time over the week when you say the word good and bad.
Yep.
It's not that it's a bad thing to say those. I just want you to notice how often evaluative judgments come up in your life. And then usually people come back the next week and they're like, oh my gosh, all I do is say good and bad all week long. I think I said it more than I ever did. I'm like, no, you're just building your awareness over how often you say that. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just about noticing it and seeing if we can start describing
Right.
instead.
One of the things that I talk about with my clients is it's in my office, not here in the studio, but there's a 7 dirty words in my office. And
Hmm.
it's if, but, try, could, should, would, probably. And I said, those are all dirty words in my office because they're all conditionals. And
Hmm.
you can't live in the world of conditionals. But to me is too conditional. You got to say and or find another word to say. And people really gravitate towards that. And I didn't tell anyone I stole it from DBT, but nonetheless I did.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of beautiful little nuggets that come out of DBT. And I like what you said about the word but, because it also wraps around to back around to apologies, right? Like we've all heard the person say, I'm sorry, but, and it's like, well, guess what? You just negated that entire apology for whatever you're going to say next. Like I literally don't care that you just said I'm sorry. So it is true. It is a conditional. And I feel like, did you say the word maybe? That's one word that I really
Maybe I
can't.
don't do, but that's a good one to add.
I can't with that word. I'm always like, well, I don't know what that means. So,
I like those words. The
yeah,
reason why I put in the seven dirty words, I could have put added maybe, but then it takes away
yeah,
that George Carlin, the call to his stand-up comedian stuff. So I don't know if I can add maybe, but it'll be in asterisks or something.
yeah, sometimes.
Sometimes.
No.
Yeah, well, I think that that's what a lot of people live in. And I think that, this is, you talked about sorry or things like that. The more I do therapy, and fawn is not quite recognized just yet everywhere, but for trauma, it is recognized a little bit. But fawning for other people is also something that happens a lot. I'm sorry. If you're not sorry, why are you fawning for me? Just tell me you're not. It's okay. Shit happens.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah,
So
it's an encourager to be more direct.
yeah, you don't need to fawn for the person across the whatever on the phone or whatever for that reason.
Yeah, and what's interesting is I think a lot of the times when something like fawning's going on is it's difficult to even see that that person may be feeling dysregulated and needing to do something like a distress tolerance skill. And it's almost like that apology is the way that they're self-regulating. And it's like, why don't we stop, take a step back, observe what's going on within us, go splash some water on your face, do a little ice dive, and then come back. And it's just like reworking, relearning how to take care of ourselves. Because when we are in a state of like fawning and apologizing, again, it's like it's how we've learned to cope. And it's gotten you this far. It's not like it is working to a certain extent. And it's just at a certain point, it's likely not going to fit with your set of values or what you're trying to accomplish. And you can end up self-sabotaging. So it's worth it to look into more effective ways of coping that will make sure you don't get in your own way.
And again, another DBT skill about self-sabotage and addressing that stuff.
Mhm.
The other part that I want to mention is, when my therapist, Joe, and I'm very open that I go to therapy myself, lets me like I go use any of those words or I start fawning, he always goes, all right, where do you feel it in your body when you say that? And that's another great thing that I've learned, that it travels across your body and where you hold your anxiety and everything else.
It's an incredible thing once you can start noticing the sensations in your body, because especially that when you're new to therapy, you ask someone where they feel it in their body, and they're like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "All right, we got
Let's
some
work
work
on it.
to do. We're gonna get used to this."
So, what I get from you is DBT has changed your life.
Yeah.
And how is it really, like, you talked about day-to-day stuff already, but do you have other examples of how it influences your life in a good way?
I mean, I know that like the mindfulness stuff, non-judgmentalness has to be number one. Coping ahead really stands out. And then I would say beyond, maybe even more so, like if I had to judge it and put something at the top, the way that we make treatment plans in DBT is based off a literal skill from emotion regulation, and it's building positive emotions in the long term. And it's about identifying your values. And we usually stick to a top 3 to 5, no more than that, so you don't get lost in it. And then you define those values for what they mean to you, and then identify goals within those values and have a top prioritized goal. And like I know what I do for myself each year is I map out, because our values will shift and grow over time. Mine have been pretty consistent recently because I'm just kind of in like a stable part of life right now. But like I revamped my values this year, and I'm very clear if someone asks me what my values are, I'm able to say kindness, community, and grit. Like that's what I believe in. That's how I try to hold myself in every situation and interaction that I'm in. And it also means that my goals are very specifically tailored to those values. So when someone asks me why I'm doing something, I can relate it back to my values. And for me, that brings me such a strong sense of identity. But yeah, I would say that building positive emotions in the long term it's a game changer just to be able to know that. And that's what I tell all my clients too. I'm like, hey, when we do your treatment plan, you're learning a whole skill and I
Right.
want you to be involved in it. And we will learn this skill again, but I want you to be able to make your own treatment plan for your life because I'm hoping that you don't work with me forever. Some people do like to be in therapy forever, and that's great. Like I'm one of those people, I probably will be in therapy forever. I do like continuing to peel back the layers of the onion. But there's a lot of people that by the time they find DBT, they're freaking done. They're like, I have been going to 12 different types of therapy for so long, nothing's ever worked, da 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 da. And I'm like, all right, I need you to just give me your all one last time. I'm telling you, this is going to be helpful. And this is, of course, after like an assessment and actually making sure that DBT can be helpful because it isn't the fit for everyone. And if I'm getting the vibe and based on their assessment, I'm like, oh, this is going to be helpful. It's like, please just give this a shot. And it could potentially only take you 7 months to a year and you could be done. And
Right.
that usually they're usually like, okay, I can do that.
You bring that up, and it was interesting because I'm a fan of therapy for life. That doesn't mean every week. That doesn't even mean every month, but I'm a big fan of therapy for life. So, what are your thoughts about therapy being for everyone, for all the time, or what's your thoughts on that?
I have historically said I do not believe that therapy is for everyone. Like I believe that there are some cultural aspects to therapy, especially in the US, where it does not fit for every single culture or every person's experience. And I do believe that there are a lot of therapies that can be experienced as very invalidating for specific cultures, especially if the therapist is not well informed on the background or cultural identity of the person sitting across from them. That doesn't mean they can't do great work together. It does mean that that therapist needs to do some work and understand that there's going to be some people that aren't going to be a good fit. And there will be some people that simply never seek out therapy because they've found some ways to cope. Kind of like I think of how my boss told me, like, oh, you kind of have all these DBT skills built in. You just need the names of them. I think there are some people that do have these skills built in. And if they don't encounter any crazy roadblock, speed bump in the road, and they're able to navigate some of life's curveballs because they've built up these skills, they might be able to do it on their own. And
Right.
that's awesome. Like, cool. It doesn't mean anyone's lesser if they need the help. It doesn't mean you're better if you don't. It just means, okay, we've all grown up a little differently. And I think a lot fewer of us would need therapy if we got to learn something like these coping skills throughout school. And that's
Well,
something that I think would be amazing. And that one of the things that I do on the side is like talk to different schools about like, hey, have y'all ever heard about this? It's really helpful. And there's a charter school out in Southern California nearby myself. I went and met with them, and now they actually do social emotional learning, but they specifically tailor it to DBT. And all their kids learn that because they're just like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Our kids do need this. I was like, oh, yes, awesome. So I think not everybody needs therapy, and a lot less of us would if we learn these skills growing up in a very clear way, like how DBT delivers them.
you said so much in this. I have so many things I want to say. The school stuff, it is absolutely pivotal that we learn these types of things. I had to learn how to do my own, but my business plan, even my personal finances, but they don't teach that in school.
I
They,
know.
they don't teach you emotional management and how to deal with that, how to communicate effectively. We've lost that ability, never mind COVID, but even through social media and the keyboard warriors that we have to deal with on a regular
Yeah.
basis. There's so many things I would say that I would change in schools. But anyway, that's maybe a different conversation for a different time.
Especially with you having kids. Oh my gosh, I could only imagine. You could probably talk for hours on that topic.
I coached for 10 years, younger girls. I think the
Mhm.
oldest was 14. I stopped last season and I did it for a long time. And you clearly saw the ones who had emotional management skills and the
Mhm.
ones who did not. But as a coach, you can't just stop everything. All right, let's do distress tolerance, everyone. It's not something that's really well received. You talked about the US and the cultural competencies. If I did that, some people would be frightened, if you ask me.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And, talk about cultural competencies, you're absolutely right. Working with first responders, that's always the first thing they check with me to make sure I can handle their stuff. And I think that if you are a sports athlete, while I could probably help out, I'm not someone who could, you're much better than me at that. And that's okay because you've lived it. And I think sometimes lived experience means a lot. However, and this is a big however for everyone listening, I've never had schizophrenia, but I worked really well with people who had schizophrenia. And you don't need to have that diagnosis in order to work with someone.
Well, and that's such an important distinction to make, I think, because I remember when I first became a therapist, or like when I knew I wanted to become a therapist, I was still in undergrad and I was talking to one of my professors, and I told her, I was like, oh, I think I want to go into grief counseling. And one of my other professors like walked in, he heard me say that, and he was like, well, have you really lost anyone? I was like, I mean, I have. I was really young. It was like my grandparents and like I can't say I like got it was like this huge problem. And he more or less was like, oh, well, if you haven't really lost anyone, I don't know how you're going to do that. And then this other professor told me, she was like, no, if you want to do that, like you do know what it's like to like if that's where your heart's pulled and you're able to sit and hold that space for people, you can still do that. Like that's okay. And that was the first thing that I did as a therapist was help run grief groups. And it's a lot of heavy work. I found out very quickly I can't only do that because it is a lot of heavy emotions to hold all of the time. But to your point of like you don't necessarily had to have had like a specific experience to help somebody. And at this, it's a dialectic, right? And at the same time, if you do have that experience, it's going to be very helpful. And that's where I know like my lane being with athletes is such an important one to me because it's like there are so many points in session where it's like therapy can almost move a little quicker because it's like, no, I know what you mean. I've been there myself and we're on the same page. It goes a long way in building rapport because you know
Right.
the person sitting across from you gets it.
Right. And I think that that's the other shift in therapy is that we bring our personalities a little more to the session. We used to be blank slates when we,
Yeah.
in the past. Nowadays, we bring our personality in. I encourage all my interns that I've worked with and even my colleagues who sometimes struggle, like, tell them why this is important for you or why it's not. And they can't do anything with it. It's just your story, as Brene Brown would say. Someone who makes fun of your story, they're the idiot, not you, for making fun of your story. So I'm a big fan of that too. But I don't know what you think about that. But I've never, when I worked with, I was 25 years old, never had kids at that point, and I was working with kids, and all the parents would go, "Well, you've never had kids. I've never had schizophrenia either, but somehow I deal with them too." And that was always
Yeah.
my standard line.
Yeah, no, I had a very similar experience when I graduated from my master. Like when I started my traineeship, I was 22 or 23 and I had to teach parenting classes. I still don't have kids. I'm 30 now. I don't have kids. I have a dog. And I got it about every single week of like, well, how are you supposed to be helpful? Da, da, da. And I'm like, well, because I remember it was really hard for me too. And I remember talking to my supervisor and he was like, your job isn't to tell them that you know what's best. Your job is to tell them that you've read a lot of research and you've gotten trained in multiple parenting styles, and you are there to deliver them helpful parenting tools that are outside of hitting their kids. Because all the parents I was working with had been accused of physical abuse towards their children. And he's like, you're just there to do that. Like you're there to offer the science. You're not saying you know what's best. They are the parents. You're the one who's saying, I've done all of the reading. I have this in my brain and I want to give that information to you. And I found that to be super, super helpful and pretty effective when talking with parents. Now I don't face that so much. I don't know if it's just because I'm older, people assume they like see a wedding ring, they think I don't know what happens, but just being older, I don't get so much of that anymore. But yeah, that was not easy. And oh, what you said about being able to be yourself more so in a therapy room, that was another thing that I feel like DBT wasn't a like Marsha Linehan was an amazing pioneer for that because she
She
was
was.
such a huge advocate for like stop acting like you have this freaking therapist hat on and you are like a blank slate of a person. Like no one's getting rid of their biases ever. Like we all have our own biases, and you might as well show up in that room, be yourself, of course, within reason. That session's not going to turn into your session. And it's important to be an equal human being. Nobody, like, think about even making a friend. Like, you're going to make a friend who, like, doesn't really tell you anything about them. Like, when I have a first session with someone, before I go into their intake, I literally tell them, I go, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. I feel it's only fair because I'm going to ask you so much about you today. I want you to at least feel like you know a little bit about me. And then I ask them if they want to know anything else. I'm like, literally anything you want to ask me, if you hit up on a limit, I'll let you know. But if you want to know if I have siblings, if you want to know where I grew up, like ask me. That's okay. I want you to feel comfortable, whatever it's going to take. So I love that DBT encourages that because I definitely didn't get that in grad school. And I mean, I graduated in 2018. I mean, that wasn't all that long ago, and it was still very much so like blank slate. The client is the only like human in the room, and that just doesn't work for people.
And thank you for making me feel old. I graduated in 2003, so thank you very much for making me feel old.
You're welcome.
Uh, all joking aside, though, you're right. I think that, once I Marsha's stuff, and I also think bringing yourself, I tell people my story and I say, if, this is my second language. So THs don't exist in French. So sometimes when there's a TH, I said, if you make fun of me, that's okay. I'm used to it at this point. And everyone laughs. And it also brings that connection. I think that when we think about therapy in general, you talked about what, that space in therapy. I go back to Gabor Mate, if you've ever
Mhm.
read his stuff. When you are curious and you connect with the person across from you, even on a video call, it's your heart is almost that electricity from your heart and from your brain just connects with that person. And that's
Yeah.
much more powerful than CBT, DBT, IFS, or whatever technique you mean. I think that those techniques enhances that content, obviously, but I also like the fact that our job is to give a good connection, have that empathy, but also have that connection with someone. Because if you don't agree, when I don't agree with my clients, I don't go, let's explore that more. I'm like, look, I don't agree with you. This is why. Convince me. And most people are like, good, we're gonna have a good conversation and we can have those conversations.
Well, and I couldn't agree more with you, especially on the front of because when it comes down to it, so much of therapy is human beings needing more connection. Like we literally live longer in connection to other people. And that's something that we haven't talked about it so much, but radically open dialectical behavioral therapy is literally the treatment for emotional loneliness. And it's all about learning skills to better connect with the important people around you. You don't have to connect with everyone. It really is quality over quantity. And it's important that the therapist is able to use those skills in that setting to be able to connect because it's such an important part of our life. That's how humans evolved. The fact that we could connect, form teams, and like build bridges, spaceships, roads, like we could do all these things in connection with each other. Without that connection, we are not advancing. Like we're not at the top of the food chain because we can run the fastest or we have the biggest claws or the sharpest teeth. We're at the top because we know how to work together. And connection is how we build that team.
Well, I think connection is exactly how we're pack animals. Humans are pack animals.
Yeah.
And if you don't have connections with others, it kills your spirit. There's a research that just came out, and I don't know where it's out of, but they were talking about you want to prevent dementia, get
Mhm.
connected to other people. It
Mhm.
actually will help and not take it away completely, but at least alleviate some of that symptomology because you're connected to people.
Yeah, it's like a grounding center. And that's where it's like, I know there's especially with like younger adults or teens, like the whole, whenever I hear someone who's like, oh, I'm a lone wolf, I go out this by myself, I'm usually like, uh-oh, like little tiny red flag, because I'm like, ooh, none of us can do this alone. And it brings about an important dialectic. Like you can have your uniqueness and be in connection with other people. You do not have to sacrifice your connection to have your uniqueness. Like, yeah, sure, maybe you're not for everyone, none of us are. It is important you find your community though, and you find that space to be in connection. And I think that's why things like AA communities have grown, and they are just across the whole country. Like it's a shared specific value that's created connection. And it's like when two people, because I worked in addiction for about a year, and it was like whenever I'd see two people who've been in the program connect, it's like they've known each other for years because they have that one thing connecting them. Like there is something about everyone that someone can relate to. Don't see that as a benefit. See that as an asset. This is your tether to other human beings, and we need that.
Right. And I think that that's what, loving to do this podcast is also to connect with people who are far away from me, yet still connect, whether it's my audience, whether it's my guests. It's just a great way to connect because, I think it's important for people to have this I'm not alone. As one of my clients last week asked me, like, I was sad, so I listened to sad music so I can really feel it. I said, do you actually know why we listen to sad music? And she says, no, why? I said, because when we hear someone else have a sad situation, we're like, oh God, I'm not alone. Thank God I'm not alone. And that's really why we listen to sad music.
Someone gets it. I mean, and so much music regarding so many different emotions. It's just they get it. And it's like the tipping point, right? Because if you're really dysregulated and then also listening to sad music, it's like we don't need to be a puddle on the floor. And there's a lot of people like I know since I'm an anxious person, like I will like hold back tears and I'm like, oh, I don't want anyone to like see that things like listening to sad music or watching a sad movie is really helpful for me to actually get that release because it's the inhibited grief, that part of DBT. That's something that was a big issue for me. I would just like hold it back. And I just watched, what movie was it? That It Ends With Us with
Yeah.
Blake Lively. Oh my gosh. I was sobbing. Like the first job that I ever had was at a domestic violence nonprofit. And it just, oh my, it brought me back to so many different stories I've heard, and it was such a release. So I do think that it is so helpful for anyone who struggles to get tears out. Listen to that sad song, watch a sad movie. It usually does the trick.
Well, I think that it's important to have those emotions. And even in therapy, as a therapist, sometimes I'm not taking away from my clients, but if I do feel sad, I'm not hiding the fact that I'm sad about it. If I'm angry about something, I don't hide that I'm angry about it because I think then that normalizes their feeling. And that's so important.
Well, and especially when a client gets like some really sad news or they're working towards something and they don't get the job or they don't get into that grad program, like how invalidating would it feel if your therapist just sits there and doesn't say like, oh, like to me, it's like, oh man, I know we've been working on this for months and how hard you worked. I am so bummed out for you. If you just sit across from someone going through something really difficult or like a job they didn't get, a school program they didn't get into, and you're just a stone wall, that's going to be damaging.
You want to screw up a relationship in therapy, someone's crying and being upset about things they've worked on, and you say, and how does that make you feel? Great way to cut the relationship really strongly. I'd rather say, ah, shit, or I'm sorry, or something like that. That sounds a lot more empathetic and truthful from my emotional standpoint than saying, and can you tell me more how that feels? I mean,
Yeah.
no one wants to hear that.
Yeah. That's definitely not the moment for that. And where do you feel that in your body?
Yeah, I don't think that Joe would even do that to me. And he's a pretty
Yeah.
good therapist.
Uh-huh.
But as we wrap up here, because we've been going for a while, I want people to be able to reach you. How would they be able to reach you in regards to getting some coaching done or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, you can find me on, if you're in California, you can find me on Psychology Today. Pretty much every therapist under the sun is on there. And I'm also on Instagram at Erica Curry LMFT. And there's a link in my bio that takes you to my website. My website is ericacurry.com. And then there's just, you can just hit the button for like contact me. You can also send me a mess. If you can't figure that out, you can send me a message on Instagram and I can send you the link directly. But yeah, that's probably the best way to get in touch. I'm also on TikTok, not as much, but same handle, Erica Curry LMFT. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to put that all in the show notes. I actually was thinking I'm going to put Marsha's book also for people
Yay.
who are curious about DBT. I think it's a great thing. I wanted to thank you for your time. This went by really fast, and thank you for bringing in the RO DBT in because we never got to it. So thank you for that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I had so much fun. This was a great way to connect and start off the day.
Well, I thank you again for your time. Well, this completes episode 179. Erica Curry, thank you so much for being here. Looking forward to hearing more from you in regards to your therapy practice and everything else. But on episode 180, we are going to talk to old friends of mine. We're going to talk to Tamar and Lane, which they have a new book out. Can't wait to share that with you and their new developments in their career. So I hope you join me then.
Please like, subscribe, and follow this podcast on your favorite platform. A glowing review is always helpful. And as a reminder, this podcast is for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only. If you're struggling with a mental health or substance abuse issue, please reach out to a professional counselor for consultation. If you are in a mental health crisis, call 988 for assistance. This number is available in the United States and Canada.